Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Day 4. Why, so it is, Mrs. Frisby. How do you do? He sounded cordial enough, but he was startled. I didn't know that you... How did you happen to be in here? It's a long story. Then tell it to me while I rest. I'm supposed to be at a meeting, but I'm late already, and a few minutes more won't matter. As you can see, I had a bad fall and broke my ankle. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope it doesn't hurt. It is mending, but I can walk only slowly and need to rest frequently. He sat down with a sigh. Now tell me what you're doing in the rat's bush. Mrs. Frisby, who was wondering the same thing about him, told him as Bruce listened in silence, interrupting only once. You went into the owl's tree? Yes, but I was afraid. I should think so. That took courage. I had to do it. When she had finished her story, Mr. Ages sat quietly for a minute, considering it. Poor Timothy, he said at last. I should have thought of that myself. But, of course, when I gave you the medicine, the weather had not yet turned warm. Then I fell and broke my leg, and I forgot all about it. He stood up. I think, he said, that you should come with me back to the entrance. But I can't. Brutus will still be there. Mrs. Frisby, having done all that you have done, you are not going to give up now. I'll talk to Brutus. You know him? I have known him since he was born. He's not very old, you know. I think he will do what I ask. From the way he said this, Mrs. Frisby could tell he did not merely think it, he knew it. But how? All right, she said doubtfully. I'll try again, but I don't understand. How do you know Brutus? We had better move along. They started back toward the entrance at Mr. Age's slow, limping pace. As to how I know Brutus, that's a much longer story than yours, and I doubt that I'm the one to tell it to you. It is for Nicodemus to say. But I will tell you this. If we go to the entrance, as we will, if you are to ask for help, you must promise that you will never tell anyone anything at all about what you see and hear. I will promise, said Mrs. Frisby. Again she thought she had no choice. The owl told me that too. When they approached the entrance again, Mrs. Frisby saw that Brutus stood at his post as before, but that another rat had joined him. Two of them, she thought. I hope Mr. Ages knows them both. The new rat saw them coming. He looked alert, dark gray in color, and extraordinarily handsome, though not so huge as Brutus. Mr. Ages, he said, how's the leg? Better, but it will be a while before I can run again. Justin, said Brutus, staring at Mrs. Frisby. There she is. That's the one I was telling you about. Is she now? Justin looked at her casually. He did not sound particularly alarmed. Mrs. Frisby, said Mr. Ages formally, may I present my friends Justin and Brutus? How do you do? Brutus sounded doubtful. Mrs. Frisby, said Justin. Not Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. She is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby, said Mr. Ages, a widow, as you know. Madame, said Justin, bowing politely, it is an honor to meet you. Brutus now looked astonished. You both know her? Who is she? Brutus, said Mr. Ages gently, don't you remember Mr. Jonathan? Brutus wrinkled his brow. Mr. Jonathan. You mean the one dragon? Yes, said Justin quickly, and this is Mrs. Jonathan. Oh, said Brutus. Then to Mrs. Frisby. Why didn't you tell me? I wouldn't have chased you off. Well, said Mrs. Frisby, I did try, but it doesn't matter. No, Mr. Ages added, because on the way out, she met me coming in. She needs to talk to Nicodemus, and quickly. Brutus looked doubtful again. Nicodemus? But can't she? I mean, how about the rules? What about the plan? Mr. Ages said. That has been taken care of. She has promised secrecy, and that she is to be trusted completely. That I, myself, guarantee. After all, consider who she is. As an afterthought, he added, and who her children are. Who am I, then? Mrs. Frisby asked herself in wonder. I suppose that, too, will come from Nicodemus. Mr. Ages said to Justin, what about the meeting? It can't be over already. It was temporarily adjourned, said Justin, to wait for you. In fact, I came to find you. Then I suppose we had better go in. Justin led the way through the arched entrance, with Mrs. Frisby and Mr. Ages following. Brutus remained outside at his post. In the library. The tunnel led gently downward, and after the first dozen steps they were in darkness. Mrs. Frisby could see nothing at all. Behind her, Mr. Ages limped along. Ahead she could hear the scuffle of Justin's footsteps. She followed the sound blindly. Then she heard his voice. Just walk straight forward, Mrs. Frisby. There's nothing to trip over and nothing to bump into. If you get off course, you'll feel the wall, he added. The dark part doesn't last long. Now, what did he mean by that? She thought it over for a minute or two as she walked and had just decided to ask him when, to her surprise, she saw ahead of her a faint glow. A light? But how could there be a light down so far? There, we're through it, said Justin cheerfully. I know that blackout bit must be annoying the first time, but it's necessary. But aren't we under the ground? Oh, yes. About 3 feet down by now, I guess. Then how can it be light? I could tell you, Justin said, but if you'll wait 15 seconds, you'll see for yourself. In a few more steps, the tunnel, Mrs. Frisby could now discern dimly its shape and direction, took a turn to the right, and she did see for herself. She stopped in astonishment. Ahead of her stretched a long, well-lit hallway. Its ceilings and walls were a smoothly curved arc, its floors hard and flat, with a soft layer of carpet down the middle. The light came from the walls, where every foot or so on both sides a tiny light bulb had been recessed, and the hole in which it stood, like a small window, had been covered with a square of colored glass, blue, green, or yellow. The effect was that of stained glass windows in sunlight. Justin was watching her and smiling. Do you like it? The carpet and the colored glass we don't really need. Some of the wives did that on their own, just for looks. They cut the glass, believe it or not, from old bottles. The carpet was a piece of trim they found somewhere. It's beautiful, Mrs. Frisby said, but how? We've had electricity for 4 years now. 5, said Mr. Aegis. 5, said Justin agreeably. The lights? They were the very small, very bright, twinkling kind we found on trees. In fact, most of our lights come from trees. Not until after Christmas, of course, about New Year's. The big light bulbs we have trouble handling. Mrs. Frisby was familiar with electricity. Her husband, who knew all kinds of things, had once explained it to her. At night she had seen the lamps shining in Mr. Fitzgibbon's house, and at Christmas time the lights that his son strung on a pine tree outside. You mean you just took them? She asked. We were careful to take only a few from each tree, said Mr. Aegis. It was like picking fruit, Justin said, rather dreamily. The annual light bulb harvest. We had to go quite far up the road before we had enough. Even so, it took 2 Christmases. Justin, said Mr. Aegis, I think we'd better get on. They continued along the corridor, which curved always slightly to the right, so Mrs. Frisby could never really tell how long it was, and which soon began to incline more steeply into the ground. Mrs. Frisby noticed that the air, which should have been dank and damp, so deep underground, was on the contrary fresh and clean, and she thought she could even detect a very faint breeze blowing past her ears as she moved. In a few more minutes the hall widened abruptly into a large oval chamber. Here the lights were set in the ceiling, and at the far end, Mrs. Frisby could see the long tunnel continued and looked as if it slanted upward again, perhaps to another entrance, a back door. Was this, then, their destination, the main hall of the rats? But if so, where were all the other rats? The room was entirely empty, not even a stick of furniture. A storeroom, said Justin, sometimes full, now empty. Then she saw that off one side of the chamber there was a stairway leading down, and beside it a small door. Justin led them to the door. For freight only, he said with a grin at Mr. Aegis. But considering your limp, I think we can make an exception. The stairs wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Frisby looked at the stairway. It went down in a spiral, and each step was neatly inlaid with a rectangular piece of slate. She could not tell how far down it led, since after the first turn of the spiral she could see no more, but she had a feeling it was a long way down. As Justin said, it would be hard for Mr. Aegis. Justin opened the door. It led into a square room that looked like a closet. After you, he said. Mrs. Frisby went in. The others followed, and the door swung shut. On the wall were 2 knobs. Justin pushed one of them, and Mrs. Frisby, who had never been in an elevator before, gasped, and almost fell as she felt the floor suddenly sink beneath her feet. Justin reached out a hand to steady her. It's all right, he said. I should have warned you. But we're falling. Not quite. We're going down. But we've got 2 strong cables and an electric motor holding us. Still Mrs. Frisby held her breath during the rest of the descent, until finally the small elevator came to a gentle stop and Justin opened the door. Then she breathed again and looked out. The room before her was at least 3 times as big as the one they had just left, and corridors radiated from it in as many directions as petals from a daisy. Directly opposite the elevator, an open arc led into what looked like a still larger room, seemingly some kind of an assembly hall, for it had a raised platform at one end. And now there were rats by dozens, rats standing and talking in groups of 2s and 3s and 4s, rats walking slowly, rats hurrying, rats carrying papers. And as Mrs. Frisby stepped from the elevator, it became obvious that strangers were a rarity down there, for the hubbub of a dozen conversations stopped abruptly, and all heads turned to look at her. They did not look hostile, nor were they alarmed, since her 2 companions were familiar to them, but merely curious. Then, as quickly as it had died out, the sound of talking began again, as if the rats were too polite to stand and stare. But one of them, a lean rat with a scarred face, left his group and walked toward them. Justin, Mr. Aegis, and I see we have a guest. He spoke graciously with an air of quiet dignity, and Mrs. Frisby noticed two more things about him. First, the scar on his face ran across his left eye, and over his eye he wore a black patch fastened by a cord around his head. Second, he carried a satchel, rather like a handbag, by a strap over his shoulders. A guest whose name you will recognize, said Justin. She is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. Mrs. Frisby, this is Nicodemus. A name I recognize indeed, said the rat called Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby, are you perhaps aware of this? Your late husband was one of our greatest friends. You are welcome here. Thank you, said Mrs. Frisby, but she was more puzzled than ever. In fact, I did not know that you knew my husband, but I'm glad to hear it because I've come to ask your help. Mrs. Frisby has a problem, said Mr. Aegis, an urgent one. If we can help you, we will, said Nicodemus. He asked Mr. Aegis, can it wait until after the meeting? An hour? We were just ready to begin again. Mr. Aegis considered. An hour will make no difference, I think. Nicodemus said, Justin, show Mrs. Frisby to the library, where she can be comfortable until the meeting is over. By this time, the last of the other assembled rats had made their way into a large meeting hall, where they sat facing the raised platform. Nicodemus followed them, pulling some papers and a small reading glass from the satchel at his side as he walked to the front of the room. Justin led Mrs. Frisby in another direction, down a corridor to their left, and again she had the impression of a faint, cool breeze against her face. She realized that the corridor she had walked in up above was merely a long entranceway, and that the halls around her were the rats' real living quarters. The one down which Justin led her was lined with doors, one of which he opened. In here, he said. The room they entered was big and square, well lit, and had a faint, musty smell. It's reasonably comfortable, and if you like to read, he gestured at the walls. They were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves stood Mrs. Frisby dredged in her memory. Books, she said. They're books. Yes, said Justin. Do you read much? Only a little, said Mrs. Frisby. My husband taught me and the children. She started to tell him how, laboriously scratching letters in the earth with a stick. It seemed so long ago, but Justin was leaving. Excuse me, I've got to go to the meeting. I hate meetings, but this one's important. We're finishing up the schedule for the plan. He pronounced it with a capital P. The plan? But he was out the door, closing it gently behind him. Mrs. Frisby looked around her. The room, the library, Nicodemus had called it, had, in addition to its shelves of books, several tables with benches beside them, and on these were stacked more books, some of them open. Books. Her husband, Jonathan, had told her about them. He had taught her and the children to read. The children had mastered it quickly, but she herself could barely manage the simplest words. She had thought perhaps it was because she was older. He had also told her about electricity. He had known these things, and so it emerged, did the rats. It had never occurred to her until now to wonder how he knew them. He had always known so many things, and she had accepted that as a matter of fact. But who had taught him to read? Strangely, it also emerged that he had known the rats. Had they taught him? What had been his connection with them? She remembered his long visits with Mr. Aegis, and Mr. Aegis knew the rats too. She sighed. Perhaps when the meeting was over, and she had had a chance to talk to Nicodemus, and had told him about Timothy and moving day, perhaps when that was settled, he could explain all this to her. She noticed at the far end of the room a section of wall where there were no bookshelves. There was instead a blackboard, covered with words and numbers written in white chalk. There were pieces of chalk and an eraser and a rack at the bottom of it. The blackboard stood near the end of the longest of the tables. Was the library also used as a classroom? When she looked at the blackboard and, rather laboriously, read what was written on it, she saw that it was not. It was rather a conference room. At the top of the board, in large letters, were printed the words, "The Plan of the Rats of Nimh." Isabella. Mrs. Frisby spelled it out slowly. The Plan of the Rats of Nimh. What or where was Nimh? The name had a strange and faraway sound. Had these rats then come here from some place else? Did that explain why they had books and electric lights and wires and electric motor? Yet they had been here, or at least there had been rats here for as long as she could remember. Still, that was not so very long. She wondered what other things they had. Suddenly she had an almost overwhelming desire to look around, to see what was behind the other doors and down the other corridors. She went to the door, opened it, and looked out into the hall. It was entirely deserted and silent, except that when she listened carefully, she could hear a faint humming in the distance, as if something were running. Another motor? She started out into the hall, and then changed her mind. Better not. Nicodemus had been friendly. They had all been friendly, but explicit. He had said she was to wait in the library. She was not there to pry, but to get help. She went back into the library, closed the door, and sat on one of the benches. The books on the table were mostly paperbacks, small enough so that the rats could handle them easily enough, but too big for her, so she sat in front of the blackboard and looked at it again. Beneath the title, across the top, in neatly chalked handwriting, were columns of words and figures. Schedule. January. Group 1, 10. Oats. 30 loads, 2 bushel. Group 2, 10. Wheat. 30 loads equals 2 bushel. Group 3, 10. Corn. 20 loads equals 1.5 bushel. Group 4, 10. Miscellaneous seeds. Estimate 10 loads total. The rest of the blackboard is filled with more rows of figures, each headed by the name of a month. February, March, April, May, and so on through July. At the bottom, a separate square was ruled off. Plows. Arthur's Group 14. Plow number 2, complete, January 1st. Plow number 3, complete, February 10th. Plow number 4, complete, March 20th. Mrs. Frisby stared at all this, trying to make head or tail of it, but she could not. It was quite incomprehensible. She was still puzzling over it when the door opened and a rat came in. It was a girl rat, small and quite young, judging by her looks. She was carrying a pencil and some papers and looking at the papers as she walked, so that she did not see Mrs. Frisby at first. When she did, she gasped and dropped the papers, scattering them on the floor. Her eyes opened wide. "Who are you?" she asked. "I don't know you. How did you get in?" She backed toward the door. "It's all right," said Mrs. Frisby. "I'm a friend of Mr. Age's." The rat was very young indeed, only a child. "But why are you in here? Who let you in?" "Nicodemus. He told me to wait here." The girl rat looked doubtful. "You might be a spy." "A spy? How could I be? A spy from where?" "I don't know. From outside. Maybe from Nimh." "I don't even know what Nimh is." "That's what you say." "But I don't. What is it?" asked Mrs. Frisby, feeling slightly annoyed. "It's a place." The girl rat, her alarm apparently subsiding, began picking up her scattered papers. "I'm supposed to be practicing my reading." "What kind of place?" "It's where we came from." "I don't know too much about it. I've never been there." "How can you come from there if you've never been there? My father and mother did. I was born afterward. I think it's white. Anyway, I know one thing. We don't want to go back. We don't want to get caught." So Mrs. Frisby thought, that sounds as if, whatever Nimh was, the rats had escaped from it to come here. But she realized that she was not likely to get very clear information from such a child. Again she hoped that Nicodemus would explain it. "Did Nicodemus come from Nimh too?" "Yes." "And Justin?" "Yes." "You know Justin?" "Yes." "I guess you're not a spy," said the girl rat. She sounded mildly disappointed. Then she added irrelevantly, "Justin's not married." She climbed on one of the benches and opened a book. "He's the best one of all. He's not even afraid of dragon." She read in the book for perhaps 30 seconds, picked up her pencil, and then put it down again. "I'm too young to get married." "I suppose so," said Mrs. Frisby. "For a while yet, but that won't last long. That's what my mother says. But it seems long, and Justin might marry somebody else." "Maybe not," said Mrs. Frisby, who could see beyond the tip of her nose. "He's pretty young himself yet. What's your name?" "Isabella." "It's a pretty name." "It's all right. Only my brother calls me Izzy." "I don't like that." "I don't wonder. Where's your brother?" "At the meeting. He's older. All the men are at the meeting, but my mother didn't go. The mothers don't always go. She's in the grain room packing grain." "Packing grain? For the plan." "She doesn't like the plan, though." "The plan again. What is the plan? Why doesn't she like it?" "It's just the plan, for where we're going to live and all that. She doesn't like it because she says it's too hard. No more electric lights, no more refrigerator, no more running water. But she isn't deserting or anything. Not like Jenner. We didn't like Jenner." "Who's Jenner?" "He was in the group, but he quit. Maybe he went back to Nimh. We don't know." Mrs. Frisby was gradually getting a picture of life in a rat colony, a somewhat confusing one because Isabella was a child, but nonetheless certain things were apparent. They had a grain room, presumably for food storage. The females sometimes went to meetings and sometimes not. Nicodemus seemed to be the leader. They had a plan for the future that some rats did not like, and one, named Jenner, had deserted, or had others gone with him. She was about to ask Isabella when the library door opened and Nicodemus, Justin, and Mr. Ages entered. Another rat came with them, a stranger. A powder for dragon. The strange rat was named Arthur. He was stocky, square, and muscular, with bright, hard eyes. He looked efficient. You might call him our chief engineer, said Nicodemus to Mrs. Frisby, as indeed you might call Justin the captain of the guard, if we had any such titles. But we don't. Mr. Aegis thought Arthur should come along, though he didn't say why. So we still don't know what your problem is. Isabella was gone. She had dropped her papers on the floor again when the others had entered, and Justin, to her intense confusion and visible delight, had helped her pick them up. Hello, Izzy, he had said. How's the reading coming? It's fine, he said. I finished the third reader last week. Now I'm on the fourth. The fourth already? You're getting quite grown up. At that, she had almost dropped the papers the third time and made a dash for the door. It did not matter, Mrs. Frisby noticed, if Justin called her Izzy, just so he called her something. Nicodemus closed the door behind her, then sat down on one of the benches facing Mrs. Frisby. The other sat down too, Mr. Aegis stretching his splinted leg in front of him. Nicodemus took the reading glass from his satchel, opened it, and through it gravely examined Mrs. Frisby's face. You'll forgive the glass and the scrutiny, he said. When I lost my left eye, I also damaged the right one. I can see little up close without that glass. The glass. Indeed, not very much even with it. At length, he folded the glass and put it on the table. Now, he said, what is it we can do to help you? So Mrs. Frisby recounted once more the events that had led to her coming there, and at the end repeated that the owl had advised her to say, move the house into the lee of the stone. She added, I don't understand just what he meant by that. Jeremy the Crow says it means the side where there's no wind. But what good would that do? I think I know what he meant, said Nicodemus. In a broad sense, lee means the sheltered side. A bird flying over Mrs. Fitzgibbon's garden would notice something most of us would miss. He reached into his satchel and took out a sheet of paper and a pencil. He opened the reading glass again. As he talked, he drew a sketch. When a farmer plows a field with a big rock in it, he plows around the rock, close enough on each side, but leaving a triangle of unplowed land on each end. Mrs. Frisby's house is beside the rock and will get plowed up, and probably crushed, as the owl said. But if we can move it a few feet so that it lies buried behind the rock in the lee, then she and her children can stay in it as long as they need to. From the air, the way the owl sees it, the garden would look like this. He inspected the sketch through the reading glass and then placed it on the table. Mrs. Frisby climbed up on the bench and looked at it. It was a rough map showing the garden, the big stone near the middle, and the way the furrows made by the plow would curve around it like waves around a boat. Show me where your house is buried, said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby pointed to the spot on the sketch. I know where that cinder block is, said the rat named Arthur. In fact, I thought about bringing it in, but I decided it was too long a haul. They had it tied on the top of harrows for weight, and it fell off just as they were finishing the garden. Can you move it? Asked Nicodemus, pointing at the sketch. To this spot right here and bury it again? Yes, said Arthur. That shouldn't be hard. Mrs. Frisby was delighted, looking at the map. It all became clear. She could see what a beautifully simple idea it was. When Mr. Fitzgibbons plowed, he would go right past their house. They would not have to move until Timothy was well and until the weather was truly warm. She remembered again what her husband had said, how easy to unlock a door when you have the key. She had found the key, or rather the owl had found it. Nicodemus asked Arthur, how long will it take? Depends. With a party of 10, a couple of hours. With 20, maybe an hour. We can spare 20, but it's still too long. He looked worried. So did Arthur. Yes, he said, we'll have to work at night, but even so, there's just no cover at all. It's wide open. Yes, we'll have to take care of Dragon, said Justin. Yes, said Mr. Aegis, and with this leg, I can't do it. I'd never make it to the bowl, much less get back again. Mrs. Frisby, looking at their baffled faces, felt her delight subsiding. Obviously, something was wrong. I don't understand, she said. I know about Dragon, of course, but at night, said Justin, Dragon prowls the farmyard like a tiger, and you don't see him until he's on top of you. Then you can't move my house after all. Well, Justin said, ordinarily. He turned to Nicodemus. Should I explain it to her? Yes, said Nicodemus. Ordinarily, said Justin, when we have a long project to do at night, sometimes even by day, we make sure Dragon won't bother us. We put sleeping powder in his food. Mr. Aegis makes it. It doesn't do the cat any harm, but he stays extremely drowsy for the next 8 hours or so. We station a sentry to watch him, and we're free to work. You did it yesterday, cried Mrs. Frisby, remembering the figures toiling the wire through the grass, remembering how strangely disinterested Dragon had seemed when he saw her. I saw the cat sleeping in the yard. Yes, said Justin, but today Mr. Aegis has a broken leg. Then he can't make the powder? It isn't that, said Mr. Aegis. I've plenty of powder. The trouble is, said Justin, it's Mr. Aegis who puts it in Dragon's dinner bowl, inside the farm kitchen. With his leg broken, he can't move fast enough. But why Mr. Aegis? Said Mrs. Frisby. Can't someone else do it? I'd be glad to do it myself, said Justin, but I'm too big. You see, Nicodemus explained, Mrs. Fitzgibbon feeds the cat in the morning and in the evening, and his bowl is always kept in the same place next to a cabinet in one corner of the kitchen. There's a very shallow space between the floor and the bottom of the cabinet. A few years ago, when we conceived the idea of putting the dragon to sleep, we cut a hole in the floor just behind the cabinet. But if we put it anywhere else, they'd see it. To reach the bowl, Mr. Aegis crawls under the cabinet. When he gets to the edge, he makes a quick dash to the bowl, drops in the powder, and dashes back out of sight. But with a broken leg, he can't dash. We might try leaving some bait outside the house, said Justin. That worked once. Once out of a dozen tries, said Nicodemus. It isn't dependable, and we don't have much time. To be safe, we ought to move that block tonight. If we had some cat food, said Justin, thinking out loud, he might eat that, even on the porch, because he knows it's his. Maybe tonight I could go in through the attic and down to the kitchen. No use, said Mr. Aegis. They keep it in a metal cabinet up on the wall. You couldn't get it without a crew, and that would make too much noise. Anyway, said Nicodemus, it would put off moving the block until tomorrow night. Then, Justin said, I guess what we do is stake out scouts wherever we can, try to keep track of Dragon and hope for the best. Some nights he doesn't go near the garden at all. We might be lucky. Or we might not, said Arthur. I don't like it. We can't dig that block out without some noise, you know. Mrs. Frisby interrupted quietly. There is another way, she said. If Mr. Aegis can get into the kitchen, so can I. If you will give me the powder and show me the way, I will try to put it in Dragon's bowl. Justin said quickly, No, it's no job for a lady. You forget, Mrs. Frisby said. I'm Timothy's mother. If you and Arthur and others in your group can take risks to save him, surely I can too. And consider this, I don't want any of you to be hurt, maybe even killed by Dragon. But even more, I don't want the attempt to fail. Perhaps the worst that will happen to you with luck is that you will have to scatter and run and leave my house unmoved. But then what will happen to us? Timothy at least will die. So if there's no one else to put the cat to sleep, I must do it. Nicodemus considered and then spoke. She's right, of course. If she chooses to take the risk, we can't deny her the right. To Mrs. Frisby, he added, but you should know that the danger is great. It was in the same kitchen yesterday, running from Dragon's bowl, that Mr. Aegis got his leg broken. And it was in doing the same thing last year that your husband died.